Welcome, MS translators, to a very special interview that we're doing here as part of World MS Day, with the theme being MS connections. And I thought, who better to talk to in terms of MS connections than our great friend, Dr. Travis Stiles, coming to us all the way from sunny San Diego, and he's already been rubbing in the weather to me so far. And as many of you would know, Travis has been a great supporter and friend of MStranslate now for many years. And in terms of MS connections, we've connected virtually. That was our first interview we did online. Then we met in New Zealand for a few talks that we gave there. And then we met again in Stockholm last year for ECTRIMS. But we are yet to meet in either one's home country because Australia won't let Travis in, and the pandemic is going to stop me from getting to America this year. But the joys of technology, Travis, how are you doing?
Doing all right. You know, I think it's been an interesting time for all of us, but at least if I'm going to be locked up in a, quarantine world, it's being in San Diego is not a bad place.
Indeed, indeed. And we're not going to bring up the weather again because I'm already too annoyed about it. Look, we'll talk about research and things like that as we go on, but with the theme of World MS Day being connections, I think one of the things that we really bonded over initially was our shared commitment to really getting out there and talking to the MS community about research and about science in general and what's going on. People at MStranslate know a lot about me in that space, but for you, what drives you to want to be involved in doing those sort of activities, and what do you get out of doing things like this?
I got to be honest. So when we met, my perspective was a little bit different. I think the pandemic has really shifted a lot of my perspective on this. Like originally, I just thought it was really important to engage patients and patient advocacy or patient advocates, just to help them channel the passion. I've always thought that public effort and public energy can really help shift priorities and goals. And I think one of the things that's been really obvious to me now is with social media and kind of like the information sphere in the global kind of sharing of information, what's really scared me in the last few months is how easy it is to spread misinformation. And as we've seen things with anti-vax groups and Bill Gates conspiracy theories, which are just bonkers, simple things like wearing a mask, which 5 years ago would be just an assumption. Germ theory says if the more barriers you have, the less likely things are to spread. But we see people being easily manipulated into now being not just anti-mask, but aggressively anti-mask, protesting, going into stores and throwing a fit because of the freedom. And so I think now more than ever, patient and advocate engagement is critical, not just to focus and channel efforts, but to combat disinformation. I think Steve Jobs is a perfect example. Steve Jobs was diagnosed early with a form of cancer that had a fairly decent treatment rate. And he decided early on he wanted to try alternative approaches. He had skepticism about, Western medicine, or who really knows? Who knows what was going on in his head. But in that delay of his standard treatment, the cancer spread and he was taken from us very early and unnecessarily. And, Brett, you and I have talked quite a bit about stuff that's out there that people either cling to too early, misinterpret, or is just straight up not true. There's opportunists out there that will take advantage of people's desperation, anxieties, and will exploit them. A lot of times for profit, but sometimes just for fame and to followers. And I've really been struck by how bad that's been in the last few months. And so, when you brought up doing this, I thought this is, practicing what I preach. This is an excellent opportunity to have this conversation because, you and I think are good examples of people who got into this for the patients, for the people that can benefit. But the reality is scientists don't get into science for the money. The money's just not that good. And so the skepticism and the hostility towards science in general just is, incredibly disheartening to me. And not to say that there isn't problems in science, it's not a perfect institution. But in general, to see such an overwhelming shift in the attitude towards science is concerning, especially when we're talking about patients. You know, the other kind of patient population that I'm very passionate about and work a lot in is spinal cord injury. And it's very similar in the sense that the patient group has had very few, like, move the needle a tremendous amount breakthroughs. And as a result, they are very eager for anything. And so it's not hard to get them to dangle a bait in front of them and get them excited. And, you know, a lot of times those things are distractions to the real progress in innovation and research. So I that was a very long answer to your very simple question, but, you know, it used to be that I really drew energy from patients and advocates. I really enjoyed I thought it was important to learn from the patients and the advocates about the patient experience, so that it helped me better inform the research I wanted to do and how that might, you know, address the things that are really important to the patients. But now I feel like I have to double down my efforts just to fight through all of the nonsense so that patients can stay informed in a positive way.
Yeah, and I mean, I think part of the problem that's existed to allow that to happen is for far too long, all of these groups have been separate. And I think as researchers, and certainly from not that long ago when I was working as a researcher, we were very isolated from, and probably by design a little bit, from the research community, because as you say, we're not trained necessarily to be communicators. But this separation always existed, and these gaps existed. And I think that's caused a lot of the problems that you talk about in terms of, you know, distrust of scientists, or misinformation being able to spread because scientists haven't been willing and or able to come out and combat it quickly.
Yeah.
And so, you know, now when we have platforms like this to be able to do it, I feel more, I kind of agree that it started off as being something that you enjoy doing and that you think is important, but I think it's becoming more and more a responsibility, because the outcomes are more serious from not doing anything.
No, I agree. And you know, it's interesting you say that able is a big part of it. I think, one, as scientists, we're trained to be. I don't like using the word cynical, because cynical has a very negative and corrosive connotation, but we're trained to be skeptical. We're trained to need a preponderance of evidence before we accept things as true. And so the needle, the kind of barrier for us to then be excited and passionate about stuff is pretty high, which is good. It's good from a scientific perspective, but it also always keeps us kind of in this moderate range of, you know, healthy skepticism and optimism. And so there's the diligence and the rigor that goes into scientific understanding will never be able to match the passion of actual charlatans, of people that are willing to pound the drum over flimsy or non-existent evidence for personal gain. And as a result of that, because we're never going to be able to, nothing that we do is ever going to inspire people, at least in a normal realm of reality, to run into the streets with pickets and you know, write their legislators and freak out. And that's a good thing. We don't want that. But it takes very little to exploit people's fears and anxieties and get them riled up over either hyperbole or fiction. And like you said, you know, scientists, one, just as from our nature, we tend to be more reserved, and there's a depth to what we want to communicate. And the alternative disinformation, there's no depth. It's just exaggeration and you know, and fear mongering and, you know, disinformation, which has a really high emotional, you know, kind of influence. But then on top of that, the people that tend to be good at that are these charismatic, you know, Candace Owens, Alex Jones, crazy personalities. And scientists, that's just not who we naturally are. You know, you and I are a little bit more extroverted, I think, than most. But it's not a skill set that scientists necessarily rely on. So, you know, it's when you mention, you know, willing and able, those are a combination of things that I think don't intrinsically kind of permeate the scientific community.
I assumed then when you said charismatic, you were about to go on a lengthy talk about me, but that's fine.
I mean, your followers, they know. I'm not telling them anything they don't already know.
Well, yeah. Comment below the video and tell me. No. It's not the point of this. Let's shift it a little bit. So I think that's where we're talking a lot about some of the issues that exist and why it's important that we're doing things like this. Flipping it. Let's talk positives. From your experience, and I know that you've done a lot of this work both through MStranslate and through other activities that you do. Questions without notice. This is all completely unrehearsed for people watching, so I'm putting Travis very much on the spot asking these questions. 2 moments, if you can isolate them. One where you think you've had the biggest impact on someone in the community through talking about your work. And 2, the flip side of that, where you've been impacted from someone in the community, maybe something that you've learned from them, maybe something that you've taught someone. So the 2 moments, if you can try and pull those out, where doing these sorts of activities has had a really big impact.
So I'm gonna answer those questions from a little bit outside of my Novoron hat. I will say that the most impactful patient interaction I have had and advocate interaction I've had came during my grad studies. And that's what kind of gave me a lot of my passion for MS. Actually, just as background, I got into research because I had my uncle was paralyzed when he was in his early 20s. So I was always very familiar with that and, the failure of the nervous system to regenerate. And then in college, my fraternity brother passed away from ALS. So I really was very interested in neuro regeneration, neuro repair. And I went to the University of California, San Diego, because I was interested in MD PhD programs, but I really didn't want to have, the more people I talked to, the more I realized that splitting your efforts between the lab and the clinic there's benefits to both, but I really wanted to focus on the research. I felt like a lot of people can be doctors, but not a lot of people can, every time you discover a new thing in the academic research realm, it's a new thing. Nobody else has ever seen it. And that really appealed to me. So I went to UCSD because they had this kind of hybrid program called Med into Grad, where they took a year of your graduate training and basically treated you like a third-year med student. So you got to basically pick your specialty, which I picked neurology, and you got a year of running around playing doctor. And that was so interesting to me to be able to get that experience and get the training and not ever have to go practice. And half of my training was with the VA. And there was a patient that had very early stage MS that was referred to us from the Las Vegas Veterans Hospital. Which, for your listeners that may not know, the veterans of our military have their own kind of health system. We take care of their health care after they're done serving. In the Las Vegas VA has its strengths and weaknesses, but neuro is not its strength. And sometimes the referrals can take some time. So we were seeing this woman who, I'm going through her chart, and she had some tingling and some numbness, and she'd had a couple, I think she was positive for the oligobands, and early stage, but they had declined to treat her until she saw us, and it took her like 3 months to see us. And so I'm reviewing her notes before I go into the room, and the way it works is kind of like the third-year students or interns sometimes would read the notes, get the patient history, go into the room, do the basic eval, get patient history, report back to the attending, and then he would come in and tell you all the reasons you were wrong or right, and give the patient what they need. And I was really good at neuro evals. I was really good at reading patient records. As a researcher, that's what, people miss stuff all the time. And I was like, oh no, look at this connection. And I walked in that room being kind of a cocky little guy, and the woman was in a motorized wheelchair, paralyzed from the neck down. And I just was like, what? And she was there with a caregiver, and instantly I was just like, how? And I couldn't really contain my shock. And I was like, how have you progressed this far in 3 months? And she was, second I asked that question, she was very emotional. Her advocate, her caregiver was very emotional. And she kind of broke down to me. She, how it had gone, how she had to really fight to get care. And, there wasn't like the specialty. They didn't feel comfortable prescribing anything for her. And I ended up giving her like a really specific neuro eval where I could basically only do sensory, hearing, and eye movement / vision. And I went and got Dr. Glasgow as the doctor in charge, brought him in, and I will be damned if he, not only was I touched by the story of the patient and the caregiver that was with her and how she kept describing how frustrating the decline, but Dr. Glasgow, a busy man who basically is mandated to see a patient every 15 minutes, we stayed with that woman till 8 o'clock at night. He was not going to see this young mid-30s woman not leave there with a really good aggressive treatment path. And that really struck me. 1, for the plight of the patient, 2, for the passion of the advocate, and 3, for the genuine altruism of the doctor. And Dr. Glasgow, one of the things, God bless him, is he was notorious for being late to his appointments. And people would complain all the time, and I would lose my mind, because I'm like, the reason he is late is because he is spending the time he needs with patients, not the time allotted. And I'll tell people to this day, if you have a doctor who's notorious for being late, odds are it's because he cares. And that's probably something you should be grateful for, because I've seen that now. But yeah, so, this disease, the benefit of MS is that we have a lot of treatment options. Not everybody can respond as well. There's a lot of variability, a lot of unknowns, but we also have tools. But those tools are limited. And, one of the things with this specific patient, I think she ended up responding decently to the treatment. I can't remember what treatment regimen we prescribed for. But at that point, with that level of extreme progression, there was never going to be 100%. We were never going to get her back to where she was. But it was early enough where if we had a way to address the damage, we could have gotten her all the way back. It happened so quick that the tissue was not fibrotic. It was not, necrotic. It was just sick. And, being able to reduce the inflammation and get the immune hyperactivity down, I remember it did a lot of good, but that missing piece really stood out to me, because this poor woman, she was probably robbed of a decade of really good functional life because of just a couple months of not being treated. So that was the kind of patient interaction. And that was a really long explanation. What was the second one where interaction where I felt like I influenced a patient? Is that what you said?
Yeah. So one where you feel like you've had a really big impact by talking to someone about your work or
so I would say one of the things I take a lot of pride in, I got into this to help people. Like, that's a stupid, silly, naive thing to say, but that's why I got into it. And so I'm very committed to, when people come to me for medical advice, I give it to them, and I'll do the research, I'll do the legwork to try to give them good advice, because the language barrier between patients and physicians is often really, really difficult. And it's frustrating for the physician and the patient. I think a lot of times people think physicians are arrogant or don't want to listen, but they have time limits, and they have expectations as far as how many patients are supposed to see. And also they're not always great teachers to teach the patient like what questions to ask and how to interpret or understand what they're saying. And so one of the things I take a lot of pride in doing is, when patients do have issues, especially neurologic issues, is I teach them a script, what questions you should ask, why, because a 30-minute conversation with somebody on that level can make a 15-minute meeting with a physician worth an hour, because you're expediting and catalyzing and you're breaking through that barrier. And I would say that the most obvious, this is also personal, but the most obvious kind of interaction I had was with my dad. My dad was actually really weirdly starting to exhibit signs of Parkinsonism, but aggressive ones. And that Parkinson's doesn't progress quickly. And I was giving him crap, telling him to go to the doctor. And eventually I was home for Christmas and I gave him a neuro eval, and he had, I mean, we're talking like legit Parkinson symptoms. And, but earlier I had him kind of talk to his doctor about what to do about it. And they had tried some like dopamine agonists, didn't really have much of effect. So I ended up doing this kind of deep dive using my dad, and turns out he had a drug interaction the doctor missed. And I ended up going with him to a doctor's appointment, told the doctor what I had found and what I was thinking was the problem. And doc fixed it, took him off medicine, and within a couple months he was back to normal. And I took a lot of pride in that, to be able to catch something like that with your family member and a loved one. That meant a lot. And it's not MS specific or whatnot, but you talk about how someone influences you, and then how maybe you can be impacted by being able to apply that and give back. I don't really think much can beat trying to get your dad not falling over and tripping on himself walking upstairs because of some simple drug interaction.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think it's an important, we don't always need to stay in the realms of MS, because I think what we do when we talk about this stuff to the community is about educating, informing how to look at science in general, how to be able to find information that's reputable, how to be able to look through data and see whether or not this is something that you should believe or not, how to put results into context. So I think, the skills that we talk about passing through to the community, I think are widespread in terms of lots of avenues. So that's really cool. That's really cool. I think one of the things that I could say about you quite confidently, having watched you do these sort of things and through our videos and through being in New Zealand, that I think is really important in terms of being able to engage and connect with people around these topics, is that you're enthusiastic. Anyone who hasn't watched Travis's presentation in New Zealand, we recorded it, it's on YouTube, we can put the link under this video. But you are enthusiastic about it and you're passionate about it. And yet you find ways to get points across. And I know the one that we've talked about again.
You're going to do the kettle, aren't you?
No,
No?
The eyeball. Tell the eyeball story, because this, when I was sitting there, it's fantastic. But when I was sitting there, I was like, this is an interesting strategy to take, but it worked really well.
Yeah, that got some gasps and some weird looks. So, look, I mean, like talking to the scientific community and not just, but also like investors and pharmaceutical company executives and whatnot. There's a big disconnect between the expectations and the kind of desired things that they want to try in patients. And early on, when Novoron was working on some stuff, there was a company, and I don't want to like throw name names, but there was a company that met with us because they saw potential for our technology in Alzheimer's. And for the most part, and I don't want to get too far into this because I could talk about this for a day, but one of the big barriers in developing therapies for any CNS condition, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, MS, spinal cord injury, any of these things, is getting drugs into the brain efficiently. Drugs that you put into the body don't necessarily get into the brain at the high level of efficiency. And that means that a lot of the negative effects that you might have in the body could diminish the potential that you get in the brain. So when we were originally starting, one of the things that I thought was really important, because the CNS, central nervous system, brain and spinal cord therapeutic development is often very complicated by these blood-brain kind of dynamics. And so I always thought, like, I don't want to risk these kind of false negatives. The big pharma, big biotech, their emphasis is always on avoid false positives, because you could waste money chasing your tail. And that is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It allows them to emphasize and drive the ball forward on important things because they have 100 programs. But when it comes to orphan conditions, things that there is no treatment for, so things like remyelination, nerve regeneration, things like that, I think taking that avoiding false positives approach is really detrimental. So our approach when we started Novoron was avoid false negatives. So when we met with this Alzheimer's company, I said, yes, I think the potential is there, but if you guys are interested in financing some R&D on our side, the first thing I would want to try is I would want to try direct injection into the brain to see what we see. Because that way we can do direct proof of concept. We don't have to worry about the really complicated variables about how, if we deliver it IV, if we deliver it orally, how much of it gets in the brain, is it enough? We can just say, look, maybe this isn't necessarily going to work in people, but let's find out if it does something first. Yep. And they were like, nope, not interested. We don't have anything to do with that. And I was just blown away by that. I was like, it's not a super complicated study. And their point was, well, if it doesn't work IV, we don't want it. And I was shocked. And I being a, you know, I think I was early 30s, and I looked at this and super scared. It felt totally out of place. And I looked at this big wig, big pharma guy, and I said, are you telling me that if you could cure Alzheimer's, but you had to inject it directly in the brain, you wouldn't do it? And he said, no, we wouldn't do it. We wouldn't have any interest in it. And so when we were in New Zealand, and I was talking about the approaches that people can take for, you know, remyelination and things like that, I asked the crowd, I said, if I told you that I could cure your MS, but it would require me taking your eyeball out of the socket and using a tea kettle to pour a drug into your brain directly through the hole in your skull, but you're cured and you can put your eye back, you're not blind, would you do it? And there was a sheepish kind of like grumbling in the crowd, and one by one, people were like, I keep my eye. My eye stays in my skull. I can still see. Yeah, every single person raises their hand. And I use that to explain, like, this is the disconnect between kind of the risk-averse big pharma and you guys. And who knows if that worked? I think they got my point. But my point was, you know, you guys, you need to advocate and let them know what you're willing to do. Because, you know, my grandma, she died of Alzheimer's. And at some point, if it required chopping off one finger at a time, but she could get her mind back, we would have done that. And this risk aversion, this idea that we wouldn't want to cure Alzheimer's if it required direct injections into the brain, which, by the way, we weren't even saying that would be what we did in people. We just wanted that to be the first step to see does it or doesn't work. Blew my mind. I mean, and to this day blows my mind. So yeah, that was the story. There was I got a lot of weird looks with that, which,
well, to be fair, so did I. I think the first reaction was everyone looked at me and said, who invited this guy?
Yeah,
I get. But I think, I mean, this leads to another really important point, and you've already just said it. And while the theme of this day is connections, this is, again, part of the reason why there needs to be a strong connection between the research world and pharmaceutical world and the community, because we need to be doing research that the community wants. And we shouldn't necessarily be making those decisions in terms of, this isn't something that people are going to want or that they'll find useful. We need to be including them as part of that process, I think.
Well, and just not to interrupt, but, you know, to that point, that's another reason why I'm really passionate about doing this. So, like I said, spinal cord is another big emphasis of mine. There was a big spinal cord meeting in Bethesda. So that's where the NIH National Institute of Health headquarters is. I don't know if all your audience knows the NIH, but NIH funds more research than anywhere else in the world. And there was a big spinal cord meeting. And the idea was they were going to bring in clinicians, researchers, patients, and other interested parties. So foundations, biotech, pharma, et cetera, et cetera. And there was an entire half of the day that was dedicated to patients and patient advocacy groups talking to the crowd. And I remember getting so frustrated because at one point there was a panel of patients and they were lecturing the scientists in the room, saying, it's basically saying it's your guys' fault. You guys aren't talking to us enough, so you're not doing the research that's relevant to us, et cetera, et cetera. And literally making the connection, saying that's why hasn't been a cure. That's why we haven't found more drugs. And here's the thing. I obviously believe a tremendous amount in an interaction between the research and medical community with patients. But what made me so upset was that they invited a massive amount of people from every interested party: pharma, biotech, investors, foundations, hospital clinics, research and patient groups and patients. No one showed up. Literally no one showed up from the biotech or pharma community. And so I got fired up, and I took the microphone at one point during Q&A, and I was like, it doesn't matter if we literally have you living in the labs with us. It doesn't matter if we're on the phone with you every morning. If you can't get pharma and biotech to understand that your passion, what you're willing to do to get them to understand that this is a field worth investing in, we'll never cure this. And the reason by the way, pissed off a lot of people. But the reason I felt like that was so important is here's a group of people that are advocating, that are passionate, that are fired up, that are willing to go to war, and they're mad at the wrong people. Not to say that there isn't blame to go to who they were, wanting to express and vent their frustrations at, but there is a massive disconnect and misunderstanding among these people that have the tools and the influence to make a difference between how to channel that energy. And so, I think that that's another really big part of this is, getting people, it's not just about making sure that we're listening to them. It's about making sure that they know where their energy and their blood and their sweat and their tears and their money even is going to serve the community best, because they don't inherently know that. And I think that it's not just about us lecturing them, and it's not just about us hearing from them their feedback. It needs to be a dialogue where we're helping them understand not just the science, but what it takes to make a drug, what the barriers are, what's missing, what's not, where their energies can go to help them best advocate for a cure, for a treatment, for the next generation of whatever. And I think that even in science communication, a lot of times that's missing. Honestly, it's missing as a researcher. I mean, after grad school and in my postdoc, I had no idea what the translational process looked like and how different fields had different obstacles to getting, to taking something that you find in a worm or a mouse in a lab and making it something you can put into a human, make them better. There's not like a grad program where you're taught the science and those problems at the same time. And so I think the dialogue, so that we can channel the medical and the research community with the patients, so that we can all be aligned, not just in what is happening, what the patient needs are, what's happening in the research, but also so that we can leverage and emphasize translation, because translation, getting things from the lab into humans, isn't easy. And so the more energy and advocacy you can have there I think is a really big factor in addressing these really difficult problems, like, for example, remyelination and nerve repair in MS.
Yeah, and I think that, one of the things that I've learned over the past 8 years now of doing MStranslate, it's been a while. Those conversations have to be genuine, and they have to have both people sitting there with a willingness to listen. And I think that that's often what's lacking from all sides, is that people come to a discussion table with something that they want to say. And we all have things that you have opinions about things that are important. I have things that are important. MS community, everyone has their things that they want to say. And that's great. And we need that. We need people to be talking up and really advocating for their positions. But at the same time, we need to be listening to other people's points of view, because often it's common ground. We all share common ground, and you summed it up right at the start. We're all in this because we want to see things get better. We want to help the MS community, hopefully end goal, we find a cure for this, but in the meantime, it's just improving quality of lives. We're all in that for the same reason, but we forget that when we sit down at the table sometime. And I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it comes down to going back to the pandemic, the fears and the anxiety and exploiting those things. When people pander to those emotions, it makes people retreat into themselves, where they have these internal fears and concerns and what's going to happen to them. When people message to them in a way that draws on those emotions, the listening goes away, because the fears then become more about me and how I feel. And I think that a big part of doing this right is empathy. and understanding that, yes, by all means, we need to know how you feel and we want to know what you want when we're having that dialogue. But it's the empathy that allows you to better understand both perspectives and advocate for the entire group. And when I say advocate, I don't mean just advocating for patients. Sometimes it's advocating for fellow scientists and researchers, or condemning or criticizing some things as well. But if it happens on the science side as well. So, I've seen patients that come in mad because they want a thing. There's nothing wrong with that. But the anger or the fear, the sadness shuts down the listening. But it's not just patients. Scientists often become really committed to their way of doing things. And again, it's not bad to be passionate about your stuff. But when you're constantly trying to pound the table about your message, again, you don't listen. So the dialogue is really important. And the dialogue really has to include empathy on both sides. It has to come from a desire to want to understand the other perspective. And I think that basic fundamental emotion is a big part of what's missing just in the global discourse now, is that people are afraid and they retreat into themselves, and empathy is lost in the equation. So,
well, I mean, hopefully, I hope that for everyone watching, it'll be interesting to see what the comments are underneath this video. If people have been watching us chatter on for quite a while now.
We could do these for 4 hours sometimes, I feel like.
We definitely could, and we will. I mean, this is like, well, that's my last question that I'm going to get to in a sec. So I'm going to give you 3 very short response questions to sum this up in a second.
Good luck getting short responses from
me. Yeah. Will we get a COVID vaccine before Travis finishes his answer? Yes or no? Comment below. I hope that MStranslate at least provides that sort of melting pot where people feel free to come and have those sorts of conversations without fear of being judged, but where they're also engaging in respectful discussion and listening. I really hope that people feel that MStranslate provides that. 3 questions for you. I've got a timer here, so I'm going to try and keep you short on them. Considering everything that's been going on, this is a very, you can't answer this one particularly short, but I'll try as much as you can. With everything that's been going on for the MS community now, what do you think the next 12 to 24 to months holds? What do the next couple of years hold for the MS community in terms of developments that people can expect?
I mean, so I'm obviously focused on the remyelination problem, in the repair aspect of things. Like the targeting the immune system, we have a lot of great stuff. Ocrevus was a great advancement. And I know a lot of cool stuff is still happening in that field, but I would say the 2 things I'm most excited about that I think that we're on the cusp for, assuming that we can keep the momentum up. One, and you and I talked about this when we were in New Zealand. You talked about the stem cells treatments, the HSCT, right?
Yep.
Acronyms, man. I think that more and more I've seen that there's like exciting stuff coming out there. That's one of the things that I think is really important when we talk about patient advocacy. So that's a tough thing, and being able to standardize and get energy behind it, I think is a big deal, because I think that there's a lot of potential there, but it is a high bar. And then various approaches to remyelination. I get kind of frustrated because I see a lot of like gene therapy and cell-based approaches to remyelination, and I don't want to ever count out or be negative about any approach, but there's a big gap between trying to use like CRISPR, which isn't a thing really, but or a stem cell therapy in MS, and so I think it's important to understand that like following those things is really important. But I think that there's a lot of cool stuff out there that is remyelination is within our grasp. I think 5 years ago, 3 years ago, I might have been like, we're 10 years out. But I wouldn't be surprised if you're giving me 24 months, I wouldn't be surprised if we have some actual clinical trials started in remyelination, which to the best of my knowledge, I think that there's only been a handful, Lingo being the most obvious one. Yeah. Those would be the 2 things. But I'm really excited about some of the other ancillary stuff, like some of the intracranial stimulation. There's a couple other things. I'm totally blanking on it off the top of my head right now. But I think that there's a lot of cool stuff. MS is not a single condition. And I think that there is a lot of knowledge being gained into the kind of subtypes and things that we can do. And I think that that's why I think it's really important for patients to be informed and active advocates, because sometimes those subtopics, those less sexy topics, would really benefit from energy and people knowing about them.
That was pretty good. I'm impressed that that was quite good for you.
It was hard. No, I'm going to be honest. I was thinking hard about it.
I completely agree. I think that's going to be the next big thing, is obviously remyelination. I know our community is super interested in it. Everyone's waiting for updates, waiting for news in that space. So I'm certainly excited. Considering that, this one super short, because you're going to see what my follow-up question is after this. So your super short response, people would be very mad at me if I did a whole interview with you and didn't ask how your work was going in that space. Quick response, because then I'm going to ask you another question at the end of it.
I'll be honest. I would say right now, in terms of the science, I am the most excited and optimistic I've ever been for the science. I am also the most anxious I've ever been for the funding. Pandemic has made things a little tough. Our current political environment here in the United States has made things a little tougher. But in terms of our work, I think what we're doing, I've always said that scientists need to be, cautiously optimistic or skeptical. I think what we're doing is going to work. I think it's going to work. Maybe the way it works won't translate into a strong enough potential in humans to make it be a thing. But in terms of, does our approach regenerate damaged tissue? I think we can confidently say at this point that yes, it does. So how we refine that into a human treatment is yet to be seen. But if I had to say, I would say you and I have been doing this for a long time. I've never told you, I think this is going to work. I've said, I'm optimistic, but I'm to the point now where I think it's going to work, which is scary, because if I screw it up, I'm going to feel so bad.
Well, we're sure you won't. Final question then, which follows on from that. Based off, and I think you and I were both as surprised at this feedback, is that everyone loved our videos from Stockholm. We thought people were just going to watch it and go, these guys talking about, but for some reason, and same feedback from New Zealand. So
did my interview, my first ever interview, did that ever go up?
Yeah, people loved it. You did a great job of interviewing Dimitri. That's got a great response.
That was scary. Oh no, that's right. That's right. We had to cut it off. I remember now. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And our chats, people really respond well to. So if people have got to roughly the 43-minute mark of this video and are still watching,
all champions if they're still here.
Yeah. Reckon we'll be able to get you on MStranslate again in the future. Maybe do these things a bit more regularly. Get some more updates on your work.
Always happy to.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for chatting to us from lovely sunny San Diego on World MS Day. I am hopeful that we'll be able to catch up in person soon, but it may be a little bit longer than we hope. But thank you for everything that you're doing for the MS community, both in terms of your research, but also in terms of your commitment and willingness to do things like this. I appreciate it, and I know that the MS community does as well. So thanks very much, Travis.
Thank you.